Welcome back, and thank you so much for being back with us for our continuation of our study of the book of Judges. We are once again looking at Samson. Last week we had a little bit of a recap of Samson, or not of Samson, but of the book of Judges up to this point, and then we talked about the highlights of why Samson is similar to the nation of Israel. And for all the people of the Old Testament who looked back to the time of the Judges and knew about Gideon and Jephthah and Deborah and Samson, they would look back and see in Samson a clear picture of the nation of Israel. Just like Israel was birthed through a miraculous birth to an older couple, Samson was. Just like the Old Testament tells us that the Israelites had the Ten Commandments, that special moral code for them that was unlike anything that the other nations had. Samson had the Nazirite code, something that was meant to make him different from those around him. And then the third comparison, the third parallel between Samson and the Israelites was the fact that Samson pursued foreign women. The Israelites, as we've seen, pursued foreign gods. So those parallels are important, and I want you to be thinking about those as we continue to look at the life of Samson. We've got a few more chapters to go through, but I want you tonight to be really thinking about the word different. Different. Hear this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He said, "Your life as a Christian should make non-believers question their disbelief in God." Your life as a Christian should make non-believers question their disbelief in God. Is that true of our lives? Is that true in our workplaces? Is that true on the ball field? Is that true when we're at the grocery store? And maybe hardest of all is that true when we're driving? But as we look at the life of Samson, we're going to see some things that are just amazing and great acts of strength. But we're also going to see, as we've talked about, the fact that his reliance on his strength became a source of weakness for him. But as we look at Samson and as we see the challenges in his life, the fact that he was born with great potential, and he never really quite lived up to that potential. He would become a judge who would rule over Israel, who would provide some peace. But at the same time, Samson, because he was a person of compromise, fell far short of what he could have accomplished. But God still used him mightily. And when we think about Samson, it ought to be encouraging to us to remember that just like we've seen with some others in the book of Judges, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 gives us some important insight. Remember, Hebrews 11 is the faith chapter. In verse 32, we read, "And what more can I say?" This is after he's talked about Sarah and Abraham and Abel and Enoch and Noah and Moses. He then says, "Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets." So Samson gets mentioned by name in the faith chapter. That tells us a lot about Samson's heart. Let's look at his life. In chapter 14, we read, "Samson went down to Timnah and saw a young Philistine woman there. He went back and told his father and mother, 'I have seen a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife.'" That's not a conversation that any of us would have in today's society, but that fit with the culture of that day. And Samson told his parents, "I have found the one that I want." His parents remembered back to his birth, remembered back to that potential, remembered back to the promise of the angel of the Lord. And they challenged Samson on his choice of a wife. His father and mother said to him, "Can't you find a young woman among your relatives or among any of our people? You must go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife." This isn't like a parent saying, "Why are you going to Kentucky?" It's not like a parent saying, "Why are you wanting to marry someone of a different race?" This is simply everything you know right there in that word, uncircumcised. We didn't talk about this last week, but the name Nazarite, that word means different. It means apart or separate. He was meant to be different. He was even meant to look different because he wasn't allowed under the Nazarite code to ever cut his hair. God wanted him to stand out and be different. God told the people of Israel, "I want you to be circumcised," something that none of the other nations around you do. And we're not going to get into all of that and the reasons for that, but it represented being separate. It meant being different. And so when they say, "Why are you choosing someone who's not circumcised? Why are you choosing someone from the people who aren't from the people of God?" Now, Samson told his father something that fits right in with the rest of the book of Judges. "Get her for me. She is the right one for me." Remember what we said weeks ago was the key verse of the book of Judges? Near the end of the book of Judges, when it says, "There was no king in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." Samson is living the course of the time, even though he was meant to be different. Samson's focused on, what do I want? What is right to me? Now, we get some insight into how God is at work here in the next verse, verse 4. "Now his father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, who wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity to a confrontation." At that time, the Philistines were ruling Israel. So God's in control. We see a picture here of just how bad things have gotten in Israel, because remember that cycle we talked about that was going to be a cycle throughout several of the Judges? That cycle where Israel would be oppressed and then they would cry out to God. God would raise up a deliverer, a judge, someone to bring them out from under this enemy nation, and then they would have peace throughout the land. And then they would get comfortable and they would sin again, and the cycle would take place over and over again. That doesn't happen here. There's no record that Israel cried out to God. God is raising up a deliverer. God is creating a confrontation on his own because he wants to remind the people of his power. He wants to remind his people that he is still in control. And then we're told that Samson went down to Timnah, and as he was on his way down, Samson had a young lion come upon him. And the Bible says that Samson used his bare hands and tore the goat apart. Well, actually, that's not exactly what it said. Look at what it, I'm sorry, he tore the lion apart like a young goat. That's really not what it said. But the part that I left out is the most important part. I did leave that part out for a reason, but I wanted to draw your attention to it. The lion comes up on him, and the Spirit of the Lord comes on him. And it's that Spirit of the Lord that gives him the power to kill a young lion with his bare hands. And then he goes on to Timnah. Doesn't tell anybody what's happened. and he went and visited with this woman. Sometime later, he heads back. After going home, he heads back again to Timnah, and he is going to have a wedding feast. As he passes the spot where he had killed the lion, he saw the lion lying there, and it had honey inside the carcass. And he reached down and grabbed some of the honey and ate that as he went on to where he was going to have the wedding feast. Samson proceeded with the wedding feast, and like grooms often do, he was probably feeling really good about himself, feeling his oats, and there were 30 of the Timnites, the people of this new non-Israelite wife. And so Samson decides he wants to play a game. Samson comes across as pretty competitive. And he tells those 30 men, let me tell you a riddle. If you can explain it to me during the 7 days of the feast and figure it out, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't explain it to me, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they replied. Let's hear it. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. 3 days into the 7-day feast, these 30 men had not figured it out. Obviously, the answer was the honey and the lion. But they couldn't figure it out. And on the 4th day, those men went to Samson's new wife, and they told him, or told her, if you don't get the answer to this riddle, if we have to provide these clothes to your husband, we will kill you, and we will kill your father's entire family. So Samson, who had faced down a lion, was now confronted with an even greater challenge, the tears of his wife. She cried. She said, you don't love me. She said, you hate me. She said, if you love me, you will tell me what it is. And Samson gave in and told her what the answer was. Then, as a result, those men knew the answer. And Samson immediately knew when they gave the answer, what is sweeter than honey and what is stronger than a lion? He said to them, if you hadn't plowed with my young cow, you wouldn't know my riddle now. Samson, actually in the King James says, if you hadn't plowed with my heifer. You can tell he hasn't been married long. But that word heifer is an interesting word. Young cow in my translation. But it's a word that really refers most likely to a milk cow. You wouldn't plow with a milk cow. He was making it clear, you've done something wrong. This shouldn't be. You wouldn't know the answer if you hadn't manipulated my wife. So Samson was very upset, and he went down and killed 30 men from that group of people. He stripped them and he gave their clothes to the people who had come up with the answer for that riddle. Then in chapter 15, Samson still considers this lady to be his wife, even though he hasn't been living with her. And he doesn't realize that her father had taken her and given her to another man. Samson goes down again and wants to have a second honeymoon, wants to spend time with the lady he had married. And her father said, I was sure you hated her, so I gave her to one of the men who accompanied you. Isn't her younger sister more beautiful than she is? Why not take her instead? Samson said, "This time I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines." So again, we see God at work to put Samson in positions where he is going to demonstrate his power through God that's greater than anything that the Philistines and their gods have to offer. You know, there's a lot of great miracles in the Bible, and there's some great miracles in the book of Judges. But this one, I can't even imagine. He went out and caught 300 foxes. I don't know how in the world he could have done that. You just think about what happens when your dog gets loose. When your dog gets out of the gate or out of the house, unless you have a super obedient dog, if that dog doesn't want to be caught, it's probably not going to be caught. It's probably not going to return until it's ready to return, right? So Samson catches 300 and he ties them up tail by tail and ties a torch to each of them, and then he sets them loose and they run out through the wheat fields and burn all of the harvest down of the Philistines. Something interesting happens after that. Samson's own people, the people who should be the people of God, find out what's happened, and they don't want to be punished as a result of what Samson has done, so they're going to throw Samson to the Philistines. And they come to Samson and they tell Samson, "We're going to take you and give you to the Philistines so that we're not all killed as a result of what you've done." Samson then says, "Promise me you won't kill me yourself." Samson says, essentially, "I'll let you tie me up. I'll let you take me to the Philistines," because Samson is thinking, if I get to the Philistines, then I am going to wipe them out. And Samson does just that. He's well tied. And then when he's in front of the Philistines, he breaks loose from his binds. He breaks loose from the ropes as if he just was wrapped in wet toilet paper. Those ropes are nothing to him because of the power of the Spirit of God working in his life. And then Samson reaches down, finds the jawbone of a donkey. And with the jawbone of a donkey, notice God had just the weapon that he needed laying there, right there for him. That's the way God works in our lives. Just like Shamgar with the cattle prod, God has in our lives what we need to be able to make an impact for him. He kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Then, after Samson does that, he sings, "With the jawbone of a donkey I have piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey I have killed 1,000 men." In the Hebrew, those words would rhyme like a poem. And I picture him singing it, dancing around, having a victory dance, holding the jawbone of that donkey. He gave a special name to that place. And after all that exertion, or maybe after all that singing, Samson cries out to the Lord, "You have accomplished this great victory through your servant. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" He got thirsty, and he quickly had a pity party. Isn't it amazing how quickly we go from victory to pity party? Isn't it amazing how quickly we go from answered prayers to gripes? Isn't it amazing how often we go from singing and dancing to whining and complaining? God didn't fuss at him. God just met his need. You would think by now Samson would have understood the power of God at work in his life was going to protect him whether he was thirsty or not. But God split a hollow place in the ground and water came out of it. After Samson drank, his strength returned and he revived. The Bible tells us at the end of chapter 15 that Samson would judge Israel for 20 years. God worked to give some time of peace to the people of Israel. God worked to meet the needs of his people. God did what he's always done in caring for his people. But what was the key to that happening? It was Samson being different. It was Samson making sure that he was separate and apart, that he fulfilled the plan that God had for him. God has a plan for each one of us. We don't have a Nazarite code, but we do have the Word of God that's meant to be something that we follow, something that we believe and act upon, and something that gives us a difference. Go back to the quote from Bonhoeffer. Does your life make other people want to be a Christian? I didn't say it the way he said it just then. I just wanted you to think about it that way. The key to making a difference is being different. We can't do that. We can't do that in our own strength. The only way that we'll be different, the only way that we'll make an impact is if we let God make that difference through us. Think about that this week. Pray about that and see how God makes a difference in your life and in the lives of those around you. I pray again that you stay healthy and that you stay strong physically and spiritually. I appreciate you and I hope to see you soon. God bless.